General Magic. Maybe give people who haven't heard of it and haven't seen the documentary, what was General Magic?
Yeah, so we didn't know. I was at Next and I was in charge of developer relations. So there was a team of 35 people and we were trying to get people to write software for the Next and teach classes and programming and all that. And one of our former instructors, who's a star, had gone to General Magic, and she was employee number 21. And she called me up and said, "You got to come over here. You just got to come over here. We're doing something, and we're not going to be able to tell you what it is. You just have to join." And Joanna Hoffman is here, and Andy Hertzfeld, Bill Atkinson. This is the dream team of the best Silicon Valley has ever produced. You got to join us. So geophysicist me went over to General Magic and interviewed and got the job just like that. Okay, what's my job now? What is this thing? And it turns out we called it a personal communicator. And the drawings looked, you saw in the documentary, the drawings looked a lot like the iPhone 6. And the concept was the same, except the user interface implementation was different. We had postcards and you were going to write with a pen or the postcards because screens in those days didn't have enough resolution and they weren't sensitive enough, to really use your finger much. You had to use a pen to write. So we would just send these postcards into the sky and to the cloud, and they would fall down on somebody else's device. So it was personal communicator. You could talk on the phone with it, and then it had your calendar and everything else. And I was to establish a developer program so that people could program for it. So we had to develop the developer kit. What are the cards that you'd use to plug into it to transfer the program over? What would be the pricing policy? We needed an app store and all that kind of stuff. And one of our first developers, I love these two guys, did a company called Lighthouse, and they had the idea that if you're moving around with this thing and you got wireless connectivity, you'd like to navigate. So why don't we load some maps on there? And if you search for an address, we can bring that up on a map and we can give you turn-by-turn instructions. Revolutionary.
Did you know at the time when you were doing this that collectively you were involved in something pretty monumental?
Yeah.
That
Once
people
we saw
would
the
look back
vision,
on?
Once we saw the vision, all of us were riveted. You want to talk about purpose in life? There wasn't anybody at General
Was
Magic.
it Mark Porat?
Mark Porat, yeah.
He was the CEO like Steve Jobs was of Next.
Yeah.
How did he differ in terms of his leadership?
Well, no one was ever able, and still to this day, able to make a presentation like Steve could. Steve was the master of the stage. I helped him with a lot of those presentations, and believe me, a month of rehearsals and late nights and everything else went behind every nuance of those presentations. He worked at that. And if he wasn't on that day, when he had some off days, he would make somebody else give it. I had to give a couple of them. So Mark was good, but not at Steve's level. But the thing about Steve is he got down to the implementation, all the fine details of implementation. And Steve had these notions. He got this from Alan Kay, who said, in order to design great software, you have to design the hardware. The two have to work together. They can't be separate. You can end up being like Microsoft, and the hardware won't quite match the software and all that. So he would not have done all the partnerships we did with Sony and Motorola and trying to adapt to all their devices. It was complicated. But Mark would go do those deals. And it was great for Wall Street. We went public. Goldman Sachs took us public, and we raised $96 million on our public offering, even though we hadn't shipped a product yet, just because the vision was that strong. And Mark could communicate the vision pretty well, and not at the level of, no one was at the level of
This is
Steve.
mid-90s.
94.
94, so well before the iPhone.
95. Oh, yeah. 12 years before the iPhone, something like that. So when we got it ready, we decided to demo it to Steve. So here's what differentiated Steve from everyone else. He came over to our lobby. We equipped him with a General Magic device. And I had the mapping software on a memory card. I wanted to give it to him. And he said, no, I think an application on this thing is a bad idea. It makes it more expensive, more complicated. You don't have control of viruses could spread. It could crash the system. No, it's different than a computer. It should have everything built in. It should be simpler than that. And so he blew me off. It's like, and this is one of those times where you think, can he see what no one else can see? Or is this one of these cases where he's wrong and he can't see how powerful applications would be? And I decided, you know what, I think he's wrong. And that's a hard thing to say with Steve, because he is so brilliant, and when he's brilliant. And so we kept going with those things. And karma happened. When the iPhone 1 was coming out, General Magic had failed, but that application turned into Google Maps and was changing the world, especially the way Larry and Sergey implemented it. I mean, with cars going around, mapping everything, pictures, and oh my gosh, the satellites and everything, they were amazing. Because they could see how big it was, as they could see with YouTube. They had a vision for YouTube when it was about to go bankrupt that no one else had. So 3 weeks before the iPhone 1 announcement, Tony and all the other engineers at Apple said, Steve, and they had this method. They get in a room around him, and Tony would say, now. And they would all lean forward at the same time and say, Steve, we have to have this mapping application. We have to have it. It's killer. We've got to have it, Google Maps. And so Steve, being Steve, calls up Larry Page, who had tried to hire him, and said, we're coming out with this new phone, and we got to have this application. And we only have 3 weeks. And can we program it ourselves? Can we get the source code? Well, that does not happen in the industry. No way. It's not possible. But Larry, being brilliant, one of the true greats, said, okay, Steve. And Sergey burned a CD right then with the source code on it. Steve hopped in his black Porsche, went over to Google, picked it up, brought it back, and in 3 weeks for the demo, they had Google Maps built into the phone. But they didn't launch the App Store with iPhone 1 because Steve thought, we don't need apps. I don't know how he thought that.
Why do you think the iPhone was successful, and when it came out, people were buying it versus General Magic? When that came out, the response was kind of not as expected. Is it a timing thing, or was it the device itself?
Both. So when I was at Next, I told you we licensed FreeBSD, I think I told you the Unix software, and we put our own graphical user interface on it and application development environment. So that gave us protected memory, security, multiprocessor, all that stuff. And we thought it was going to be fast and easy. It took us 5 years, 5 years of blood, sweat, and tear. It was so hard to do. But the engineers who did it, one of Steve's trademarks was do it right. Just take the time and do it right if you have to. I'll keep the company alive somehow. He did that for Pixar with Toy Story too. It was supposed to take 2 years to do Toy Story. It took 4. And Steve just said, make it great. Just make it great. And that's why Toy Story was great. So we came up with this great operating system, and we didn't have that for General Magic. We had to generate one from scratch, and they're bloody difficult to do. It's the hardest thing you can do in software engineering. It takes a special kind of person to do them. Who's a level above application developers or anyone. They have to think about architecture carefully and everything. So our architecture wasn't as good, for one thing. And that next step we called our operating system. Apple bought Next for $450 million. I helped with that sale, broker that sale. And that drove the renaissance that became Apple, because it became OS X and is still OS X today. And when Tony was doing the iPhone, there was this whole question of, do we try to adapt that big operating system that's on our desktops and laptops to a little device? Or do we go with something lighter? And so they did a big evaluation, and no, they used that. So next step, the thing that we blood, sweat, and teared together for 5 years or more at Next, drove the renaissance of Apple, OS X, and it drove the iPhone. And it still powers the iPhone today. It's what made the iPhone so great. And our operating system wasn't that good. As you saw in the documentary, you would get the spinning disk as it cleaned up files and things like that. Its memory management wasn't as good. Operating system is a very hard thing. And not only that, but the components were more expensive. Battery life wasn't as good. We didn't have the Wi-Fi networks or the wireless networks then. So we were just too soon. And Steve had a much better sense of timing.
This episode is proudly brought to you by Inside Tracker. Track your blood biomarkers, understand your biological age, and receive personalized lifestyle tips backed by evidence to optimize your health. To get started with Inside Tracker today and get 20% off your first purchase, head to insidetracker.com/Simon. That's insidetracker.com/Simon for 20% off. Is the general sense that General Magic was a failure?
Well, we thought so. We all hung our heads in shame, but we all got hired everywhere. Silicon Valley recognized how concentrated the talent was there. So if you had General Magic on your resume, the insiders, the venture capitalists all knew, ooh, you were something if you'd worked there. Tony got that job starting doing the iPod. Like Megan Smith, who you saw in the documentary, she became Obama's chief technical officer in the White House, and she was a VP of development for Google. John Giandrea, who was a junior engineer there, I don't think we even mentioned him in the documentary. He went on to become head of AI at Google, and he's now head of AI at Apple. I mean, you're not going to get a brighter group than that. And the brightest of them all was Bill Atkinson. He's too camera shy to be in the film. But I'll tell you a personal experience I had with him and the iPhone. By the time the iPhone 4, the iPhone 2 was what had the App Store. And it had it because sales stalled, pinch to zoom and all the nice things that Apple copied from the Mission Impossible movie with Tom Cruise, made it really sexy, but without applications, it just wasn't going anywhere. So Steve finally caved on the iPhone 2 and they did the App Store. But then it became clear after about the iPhone 4 that people were using it to take these crappy pictures with, and they really needed to do it better. Well, Bill Atkinson had moved on into photography and had become the most respected technologist in photography. He wrote all the drivers for Epson printers and high-end, printing presses that made their colors come to life and made them true colors and everything else. The guy is he is one of the brightest people I've ever worked with in my life. And so they're developing the iPhone 5 and Steve wants a good camera. Who's he call? Bill Atkinson, of course. Who else would he call? And by that time, I had, these photography companies going, and I was printing big photos, and I was going to have lunch with Bill and everything. And he was sending me some of his email conversations with the iPhone team, with Tony and the others, about how to make a great camera on the iPhone and do the right drivers and get the white balance right and things like that. He revolutionized the camera, and damn, it's like you still can't beat an iPhone. If you're into photography, especially videography, you're not going to beat the video on an iPhone. And as smart as those guys are at Google and Samsung and everywhere, they still cannot match the iPhone.
What's the computer museum that pops up in the documentary?
View? Yeah, in Mountain View. I was on the stage there for the General Magic film. We did an airing there, and then I answered questions from the stage along with Mark Peratt. And the Computer History Museum, it's really interesting to go visit there. General Magic devices are there. You saw in the film that Andy Hertzfeld is visiting it. And he said something I didn't totally agree with, but he said, I can tell that innovation is really for the young. Most of these innovations are for the young. But how did he explain Steve with the iPhone and Bill Gates? I mean, they were innovating some pretty amazing stuff, late into their careers when they were the two old men in the industry. So, the Computer History Museum in Mountain View, if you're ever up there, come with me, I'll take you through it. And we can bring somebody like Andy or Joanna Hoffman, and they can explain some of that stuff to you.
I'm not sure if it's a word that you used or it came up in the documentary, but there was someone said Misfits.
Yeah, exactly.
And that struck me because having watched your first TED Talk as well, you spoke about your uniqueness or weaknesses being your superpowers.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think there's just something special through that story about all of these people coming together who people may see as misfits, or maybe themselves they see.
We were misfits.
They felt like misfits,
Yeah.
but they were able to sort of tap into what is their ultimate strength.
Yeah, it's so amazing. You know, I've gushed about Joanna Hoffman, all of them. Joanna Hoffman was played by Kate Winslet in the Steve Jobs movie. And all of us who know Joanna very well cannot tell the difference between Kate and Joanna on the screen. Kate Winslet, and she got a Golden Globe for it. She was a misfit, and she had a fiery temper. She'd just lose it, you know, in the middle of a meeting and start cussing like a sailor and storm out of the meeting and slam the door and everything else. And you think, wow, we got a bunch of misfits here. Steve, of course, Steve, he always had to have the best of everything. So we had to have the best ad agency in San Francisco. And they could talk to him and push back on him. Like with the Next, he wanted to talk about how great the imaging language was, and the color printer, which was 12-bit, and the operating system, and the head of the agency glazed over and said, Steve, one thing. And Steve said, no, there's 7 things, not one thing. And so he crumpled up 5 pieces of paper without speaking and threw them at Steve and said, catch. And they went all over the place. And then he crumpled up 1 and said, catch, Steve. And Steve caught it. And Steve said, okay, I get it. And Steve, you know, he had a strong emotion, but you could push back on him. And if you could give him something simple like that. So you notice in the Apple ads, I don't know if you ever saw these Apple versus Microsoft ads, one thing on a plain white background with just 2 actors and the computer, stripped of everything. That was Steve and his marketing. So at that agency, Steve wrote an ad, or they wrote an ad. I think it was a draftsman who wrote the ad, actually. And it was, it's beautifully worded, just amazing wording about, I mean, we should pull it up and you put it in the episode or something, but it's how people who think they can change the world are the ones who do. That's the concluding line. And in order to, it's the crazy ones. It's all about the crazy ones. They didn't call them misfits. The crazy ones are crazy enough to think they can change the world. And the ones that are crazy enough to think that are the ones who do. And Steve believed that. He could change the world even though he wasn't the brightest guy around. And so the ad agency wanted him to narrate that, and he wouldn't do it for some reason. We don't know why he wouldn't do it. So they got an actor to do it, and it became this wonderful ad. It's just this iconic ad. It's one of the best ads I think I've ever heard or seen. But at his memorial, when he died at Apple, they had this huge memorial at the Steve Jobs Theater and the plaza and everything. They played that ad with Steve's voice, and everybody cried. You know, it's like, we're going to miss him forever. And Dean Ornish could have saved him. He had pancreatic cancer, and your last episode, I thought of Steve the whole time when you interviewed Crystal, and she said, don't think that you can cure cancer by diet alone. You got to go do chemotherapy or whatever the best treatment is. And Steve and his ideas about, you know, curing his pancreatic cancer with green smoothies.
Was he a fruitarian?
For a while. I didn't know him when he was a fruitarian.
Okay.
It's funny because at Next, not a lot of people were very health oriented. They were going out and having ham and cheese sandwiches and white bread and things like that. But by that time, I was fairly health oriented. And so I would go out to this burrito place that was the precursor to Chipotle. And I would get, you know, brown rice and beans and all that stuff. And Steve saw me with that a few times, and then he would always come and can get me lunch. And a couple of times he asked me if I was Seventh-day Adventist. And I didn't know why he would ask that. I didn't know what a Seventh-day Adventist was, really. So I just shrugged it off. I didn't want to get into a debate with him. Anyway, I'd bring him back all these burritos all the time, and he would eat those. I had lots of dinners with him that were catered in when visiting dignitaries would come. And there would be a salad and all of that. But there was a plate of cookies. There were 6 cookies on this plate. And they looked kind of healthy, whole grainish kind of cookies. But in the early 90s, they probably had a lot of Crisco in it, trans fats. And he loved those cookies, the trans fats and sugar. And he would go down on the whole plate of 6 cookies. And I always wondered, what's in those cookies? I wouldn't eat them. But I had a weakness for peanut M&Ms in the day because we had those around the building, and I couldn't resist eating handfuls of those. I shouldn't have done that.